I'm going to ask ChatGPT for another debugging exercise following up on the previous one. However, one issue I had with the previous exercise was that it seemed like the bug was buried inside of this sort of obscure use of getchar to read integer values, which is something, although I had to be a good sport and do the debugging exercise anyway, I feel like this isn't really the kind of question you'd be asked in CSC 111. So I got myself into hot water with that. I did the exercise anyway. What I'm going to do to get around that now is I'm going to say, can I have another exercise? And I'm just going to say this time I'd rather the exercise did not involve user input. That way it won't use getchar. It might still do something else that I have to fight with it about, but hopefully it doesn't use getchar. Certainly. Okay, let's take a look at what it comes up with here. All right, so it says, here's a debugging exercise that doesn't involve user input, but does still focus on some of the concepts I mentioned. A quick skim through it, from my eyes, it looks like it is using only concepts that we've already seen. And let's take a look. It says there's a bug in the sum function's loop condition. Okay, that's a bit too specific. Maybe I shouldn't have read that. Maybe I'll stop reading and just try doing the debugging exercise. So I can click on this to copy the code. We'll head over here. I'm going to replace all of my code with what ChatGPT generated. Okay, practice debugging 2. So I'm going to try running it. We can see here that it didn't have a compile error. It seems like the problem is a logical error. And now I want to try and figure out what the bug is. So it looks like when num is set to 5, it says the sum of integers from 1 through 5 is 15. Okay, so the very first thing I do is just compute that myself, basically. Let's see whether or not the bug is evident on this particular value, this particular parameter value. Okay, so 1 plus 2 plus 3, that's 6, and then plus 4 is 10, plus 5. Okay, well, that does equal 15. Okay, well, that's fine. Maybe the bug is more subtle than that. Let's set num to 6. Now, the sum of integers from 1 to 6 should be 21. Okay, and it is. And again, I'm wondering if ChatGPT hasn't misunderstood what I'm saying. So it already gave us the hint that the bug was in the loop condition for the sum function. But this sum function is simple enough that we could sort of unpack this just by sight. But we could also trace through it. And you know, for my money, I don't see anything obviously wrong given the specification of the function. And maybe we need to ask ChatGPT what the expected output of the function actually is, because it hasn't given me a rigorous specification of what the function's supposed to do. So how am I to know whether the function is truly doing what we want or not? So I'm going to go back over and ask that. Can you generate the formal specification for the sum function in that example? All right, so it's going to generate something that's a bit more formal now. We'll scroll up and not be spoiled too much on what's going on. So it calculates the sum of integers from 1 to n. The parameter n, which we passed into the sum function, so here's the sum function again, although it's written a little bit differently this time, is the upper limit of the range. This notation here, we don't use this notation in 111, but this is at pre stands for precondition, which is something that we can reasonably assume is true about the input value of the parameter. So it's saying we're assuming that n is greater than or equal to 0. It's not necessarily positive, but it isn't negative. The return value is the sum of integers from 0 to n. Okay, so I'm looking at this and saying, it does look a lot to me like it is computing the correct sum. As long as the sum is from 1 up to and including the value of n, I'm not sure that I believe that this version has a bug, or that the version in the original example, which is a tiny bit different, it starts the count at 0, whether that has a bug. I'm wondering if ChatGPT is considering, it's saying you want to compute, let's say, 1 plus 2 plus 3, which is supposed to equal 6, but this code is doing 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3. That's a bug. That's not a bug in my eyes. That might be a little bit of an oversight, but we know that adding 0 to something has no effect. So actually, I'm going to throw in the towel here. I'm going to say I wasn't able to find any bugs in the sum function from earlier. Can you give me the answer? Of course! I apologize for not providing the answer earlier. The bug in the sum function is in the loop condition, and then it gives the corrected version of the function. Let's copy this and go take a look at that next to our original. And if you stare at it for a minute, it looks like my theory was correct. The only difference that I can see between this version and this version is this initialization. I do not consider this to be a bug, and I think I think you might agree with me on that front. It's true that yes, this loop is running for one step longer than it absolutely needs to, but does the code work? Does it generate the right result? Yes, it does. Adding 0 to something doesn't change it at all. So I don't consider that to be a bug. And the question now is, how much of my valuable time should I waste trying to convince ChatGPT of that? I don't think that starting the loop counter at 0 instead of 1 when computing a sum is a bug. Let's just see how it reacts. You're absolutely right. You know, I think it might be a bit of a pushover. I suspect that if I tell it that I believe strongly about anything, it's going to say, oh, I agree. So I apologize for the confusion. The loop starting at 0 is not a bug. So given that clarification, are there any bugs in the code from earlier? Apologies. After reviewing the code again, it seems there are no bugs in the code you provided earlier. Okay, so the last 6 minutes was just me going around in circles with ChatGPT. I see. Let's just add a little bit of discontent to our response. It's trying to keep things positive. That's good. Can you generate a new exercise? This time, I'd like there to actually be some bugs for me to debug. Certainly. Okay, so now it's going to generate a new exercise. Oh, it's going to use scanf again. Okay. I don't want an exercise that involves user input. I apologize for the misunderstanding. I don't know. The apologies are beginning to get a little bit annoying. It doesn't need to apologize. There's nothing, misunderstandings. ChatGPT is not a human person, so I mean, I don't need to feel too guilty about this, but for all you human people out there, when there's a misunderstanding, there's no need to always apologize. It's just a part of life. That's the way it has to work sometimes. ChatGPT is almost obfuscating in its inability to understand me, but I don't know whether that's my fault or its fault. Okay, so I apologize for the misunderstanding, whatever. Here's the debugging exercise that doesn't involve user input. I'm honestly tempted to ask, are you sure? Before I start on this exercise, are you sure there are bugs? Needs to take a minute. Well, it's a good thing I asked. I apologize for the confusion. It's one thing it's great at is saying it's sorry. After reevaluating the provided code, I don't see any intentional bugs in it. Okay, it just said that there's going to be some intentional bugs. So I've mentioned this earlier, but if any of you out there were worried that ChatGPT is going to take your job as an engineer, just think about moments like this. Okay, so fair enough. Can you generate a new exercise, one that doesn't involve user input, and make absolutely sure that there actually are, I'm going to put are sort of underlined, bugs in the exercise before you respond? Certainly. My apologies for your apologies. You know, your apologies are becoming worth less and less as time goes by. The best apology one can make in life is a change of their behavior. If you're truly sorry for doing something, just make sure you don't do it again. There's no hard feelings. Continuing to make the same mistake and apologizing doesn't really represent an improvement in my mind. Here's a new debugging exercise with intentional bugs. Okay. All right, let's give this one a try. Copy code. Actually, I'm going to ask for clarification again. Before I start, are you sure there are bugs? You know, I might have found a bug in ChatGPT. it seems like it doesn't actually know how to create incorrect code. Okay, so I'm going to quickly stare at this code and just as on a spot check basis, try and figure out whether it's worth trying to do any further debugging. So it looks like the point of the code is to compute the product of all of the odd numbers up to and including a particular value. So the idea here would be if I give n, if n is set to 7, then I guess I want the product 1 times 3 times 5 times 7. And this is an interesting exercise to try out on your own, like whether you could write the same code we have here. We actually did something similar to this, adding up the sum of even numbers with the exercises filed under week 2. So this is just the product instead of the sum. If I want to skim through the code at a high level, so on a comprehension level, just reading the code, what I have is I've got this loop here that is iterating from 1 all the way up to n, but it's counting up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It counts through even numbers. And then here, what it's doing is at each iteration of the loop, it asks, is the current number an odd number? And if it's an odd number, it multiplies it into the result. And for my money, that does look pretty correct. Now, of course, bugs can hide in plain sight. It could be incorrect, but because the author of the code, that is to say my new colleague ChatGPT, turns out not to actually think there are bugs in it, I don't think I'm going to debug that further. It says, if you'd like me to create a new exercise with actual bugs, please let me know. Okay. I have thought about it. And I would like you to create a new exercise with actual bugs. Make sure there are actual bugs. Now it's going to use scanf again or something because I didn't specifically tell it not to. Okay. So now it's saying, here we go. I apologize. Oh, you do apologize. So we've got main. We take a number. We compute that number squared, as far as I can tell, by calling this function called square. The function called square is a single line function that returns n times n. And I'm going to ask it the same question. Are there bugs? Are there really? Yeah, I don't think ChatGPT knows how to generate code with the kind of bugs I'm looking for. Okay, this isn't going anywhere. Can you generate an exercise, a debugging exercise with syntax errors? So one advantage of this is that at least if it turns out to be correct, we'll know because it will compile. So we haven't, the previous example we got didn't have any syntax errors, it had a logical error. So here's some code. This code apparently contains syntax. Certainly. Here's a debugging exercise with syntax errors. Okay, I'm going to skim over it. I'm actually already seeing the syntax errors without having to try it myself. It looks like we're missing a semicolon, both of the printf statements. I don't see anything else that could be a syntax error. I'm going to say, I think I found the errors. Both printf statements are lacking a semicolon at the end of the line. Are there any other errors? Now, on a midterm, I wouldn't be allowed to ask questions like this. If I ask you to find issues with code on a midterm, you have to find all of the errors. But because ChatGPT seems to have a mixed record of actually being able to do what I ask, I figure I deserve a clarification. It says, you're correct. The missing semicolons are indeed the syntax error. There are no other syntax errors present. Okay, that seemed a little bit more productive. Can I have another exercise with syntax errors? Preferably one that is much more challenging. Oh, I didn't ask it as a question. Hopefully it figures it out. Okay. So let's take a look at this. It says here's a more challenging debugging exercise with intentional syntax errors. So A is equal to 5. Okay, missing semicolon. Oh, but then down here, this if statement is missing a closing bracket. Okay. I noticed that the else clause is written in a way that I wouldn't normally write it, but it's valid. And then down here, I noticed that there's a semicolon missing from the end of the printf statement. I can see that two statements are Actually, I'm going to ask it for line numbers. Can you repeat that, but add line numbers to the code? You'd wonder why it doesn't do line numbers by default. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the errors that I found are on line number 4, line number 15, and line number 7. I found errors on lines 4, 7, and 15. Are there any others? These are the only syntax errors, if I really take its word for it, these are the only syntax errors in the code snippet. Okay. Can I have another exercise, even more challenging than the last one? Let's see what it comes up with here. All right, so this exercise contains several intentional syntax errors for me to correct. Let's just see. It seems like I've been doing a pretty good job of just skimming over this. I haven't needed to run this code yet. Several intentional syntax errors. So I've got a function called print numbers. It's return type void. That nothing looks incorrect about the syntax of this function, so I declare a variable. My for loop is set up correctly. A common syntax error I see is people that use commas instead of semicolons here. That looks good. I've got a printf statement. Nothing looks out of the ordinary there. I've got a main function. I'm missing a semicolon. Okay, I'm going to say with line numbers, please. So the only issue I see is a missing semicolon on line 13. The errors are on, oh, actually it says this. The errors are on lines 13 and 15, among others. I see. And I go and ask myself, so exactly what error does it think is happening on this blank line? I see the error on line 13. What is the error on line 15? Now, I sort of know what it's going to say. It's going to say, oh, I'm sorry. It turns out there isn't an error on line 15. But let's see what it says. Yes, okay. Apologies. It seems I misspoke. Yes, it's not your day, is it? Upon closer inspection, there is no error on line 15. Okay, let's just ask it for another one. And I think I have to be very specific. Can you generate another exercise with syntax errors? I want it to be more challenging than any exercise I have ever done in my life. Also, I do not want any of the errors to be missing semicolons because it seems like that's sort of a cheap way of adding errors. Wait for it to think. Of course! And it's going to generate, here is a challenging debugging exercise with syntax errors, none of which involve missing semicolons. All right. Oh, come on. Okay, so I'm going to ask it for line numbers. Can I see that again with line numbers? It doesn't seem to remember that I like line numbers. Certainly. Okay, so, yeah. It seems like I need to have a word with it. So it was very confident that none of the errors involve missing semicolons. And, you know, if I go look at the version with line numbers, let's see. Okay, well, there's x and y are defined. There's sum and product. Sum is a variable defined to be x plus y. That looks all right. Product is x times y. That's also all right. I then print them out, and of course, look at line 10. There's no semicolon. Okay, well, we'll just look at the rest of it. And then I run a loop. The loop statement looks good to me. I then have an if statement that looks syntactically correct. So are there any errors besides the one on line 10? That's line 10 is the missing semicolon. I'm going to give it some trouble about that missing semicolon. Okay. So I misspoke again. Upon reviewing the code, the error on line 10 is the only error. Okay, so the error on line 10 was a missing semicolon. You promised that there were no missing semicolons. I feel betrayed. And it apologizes. It, it's so nice that it's so eager to keep providing me with another exercise, but I don't know. I'm going to give it one more chance. Okay, I'll take another exercise. It's going to not have line numbers, and it's, yeah. Okay, well, here we go. This is the last one I'm going to do. So this one is, we create a variable storing a number. We print out the number is, and then the line's missing a semicolon. There is a syntax error here because we're missing a closing bracket, and then that's it. Oh, no, wait, there's a missing curly bracket after this printf statement. So after the second printf statement, or the third printf statement, we're missing a curly bracket on the else. Okay, so I've learned a couple of things today. One of them is, it sounds like ChatGPT has a real problem generating code with bugs. And this is interesting because we've already observed that ChatGPT can seem to write correct, that is to say syntactically correct code, pretty well. So when it suggests programming exercises, it's often been able to give us valid solutions to those exercises. It's even pretty dexterous with generating variations. So we saw in the last video that it could, for example, it could turn a scanf call into something else. However, when I ask it to make things that are incorrect, it doesn't know what to do. And even when I push it, and I've been pretty patient here, even when I push it, it still can't quite figure it out. All it seems to be able to do is to remove semicolons and to get rid of some punctuation, so it gets rid of brackets. It isn't actually able to duplicate a lot of the errors that I'm sort of expecting. So and some that you've seen and that I've seen. So errors that I make in my own videos, errors that you make in your assignments, things like using the wrong type for a variable, things like having your loop iterate way too long. It almost did that earlier, but it doesn't seem to understand exactly what I'm asking for when I want incorrect code. I don't know. And as we've seen, when ChatGPT gets something wrong, there's basically nothing you can do to set it right. It'll keep telling you what it's doing is correct, even if it continues to be incorrect, and it doesn't really learn very much from you trying to tell it that what it's doing is wrong. So, okay, we tried to get some debugging practice. Really, mostly I've gotten practice in sort of being patient, arguing with something that doesn't really know how to learn from what I'm saying. So I'm just having an argument with an inanimate object. So I'm glad I'm putting that PhD in computer science to good use doing this.